So the topic here, I admit to I've embraced my curmudgeonness as a privilege of age, and when I think about the Internet of Things, I relate it to frankly all the way back to when we had raised floor data centers, and then these things came out called PCs. And everybody was moaning about how they had complete lack of control. They didn't know where the PCs were. They didn't know how to secure them. And how could we possibly trust them? After that, well, at least you could trace the wires. And so then you had Mac level security and so forth. But then the wires went away. And we still managed to muddle through access points and measuring and so forth. And then phones grew up. And they provided an alternate network as well as computing platform. And arguably, that's still a moving target. So when I think of the Internet of Things, I think of it as another one of, oh my God, we've totally lost control. And the purpose of this panel is to kind of explore some of those issues, provide different perspectives, get some interaction from you as well as some challenges. Because I think that we're actually at the point where we at least have elements of how to address I'm not going to say the problem, the challenge, and at least whittle it down to something that we have a little more experience with. So the way we've constructed it is the panel themselves have offered up a few questions, and the rest of the panel can also chime in. And if you have questions and I don't quite see you back there, then just be just a little bit louder, and we'll roll with that as well. Okay, so I think the first is kind of as a warm-up exercise. Just wanted to ask Jasper, name 3 or 4 things in your home that qualify as Internet of Things. So let's start with what you know when you go home.
Right. So you can talk about sort of crazy things like is your refrigerator connected to the internet? And certainly I think people think in those terms. But if you get a little bit more realistic, at one point I counted the number of things in my home that were connected to the internet that, not so long ago probably didn't have any business being on the internet. But my son is an avid gamer, and all his gaming systems need connectivity to the internet, and I'm not sure what is happening there. I'm a technology adopter myself, and I use things like the Ring video doorbell. And I don't know if anybody saw the news that Ring disclosed in the last week or so. Certainly your phone connects to your network, your work computer, you probably are connecting to your network. Baby monitors, smart thermostats, smart locks, any of these things. And the proliferation is unbelievable. And I think it gets away from most people. You don't realize, and I didn't realize, I sat down and, as preparing for this, I counted up the number of devices in my house connected to the internet. I'll take Glenn's signal there by putting the watch that I should move along.
That's facing me, you notice. By the way, there's a microphone in there as well as a microprocessor, but don't worry. I signed a privacy disclosure. Just if you would now extend that to the office environment or an industrial environment and tell me, what are the top threats that you see?
Right. Who brings your personal phone to the workplace and connects it to corporate Wi-Fi, right? You guys have a sense if that corporate Wi-Fi is segmented from sort of your normal work Wi-Fi? Hopefully it is, maybe it's not, but these are things for security practitioners to think about. Who here has a smart watch? Anybody have a smart watch? There are environmental monitors. I worked in a building at one point that the blinds were connected to the internet, so the blinds would track with the sun to make sure it was maximizing the use of daylight. It was a LEED certified building, so trying to maximize the use of daylight and balance the lighting and the blinds, all connected to the internet. And so from a sort of traditional security practitioner perspective, you've got departments who never have thought really about IT engagement now putting things on your network, whether you know it or not, real estate or facilities, sort of connecting devices to help manage. And it's not new, it's been around for a long time. But I think the proliferation is there in ways that people don't realize. And, your co-workers are not malicious. They're, trying to be innovative. They're trying to be efficient. They're have good intentions. And next thing you know, you've got security devices on your network, or devices that need security focus on your network that you might not have visibility to.
So now, just to hear other perspectives on that from other people on the panel.
Yeah, I think another thing I've seen there is the connected car. So we think of the connected car as something that's outside the workplace, but it can be connected to the workplace. So an example I recently saw with one of our clients was Tesla sitting in a parking lot using corporate Wi-Fi begins to exfiltrate data from the car through that connection. So I think the whole expansion to autonomous vehicles, obviously there's a lot of connection that's necessary to have those vehicles operate correctly. And that's going to add another level of IoT, both I think in the corporate environment and outside of the corporate environment. We're seeing a lot of clients begin to be more and more concerned about that in their process of building those cars or working with manufacturers. So I think that's another element.
So I've been in this business for it'll be 25 years next year, and I've gotten pretty paranoid. So I'm thinking of what's in my house. It's just laptops and phones and a printer, I think, because I don't want any of that in my house. And it's the same with the cars. I don't want a car that's connected to the internet. I've been doing this a long time. I'm in the risk management business, and when you understand things that can go wrong, it kind of kills it for you. There's a lot of convenience and that associated with those devices, but somebody in this profession, it's less intriguing.
Well, so little audience participation in this. I know I get a kick out of my Android phone sitting on the table, and somebody goes, "Good evening," and it wakes up to see if it's really, really is being talked to. Sometimes inserts into the conversation, "I'm sorry, I really don't know how to help you with that." But in the audience, of all these manufacturers and so forth, how many, just a show of hands, how many do you think that these manufacturers, the Internet of Things devices that we listed, do the same things, the same exercises, the same controls, code reviews, architecture reviews, regular scans? I just want to, yeah, everybody's raising their hand. Okay, yeah. So they've kind of backed into, like, say Fitbit. They backed into this world, and they didn't really come up through the same level of controls and considerations that we already have in IT. So that represents a bit of a gap and a bit of a threat.
If I can pipe in, what's a little bit sobering to me is if you take a look at the Ring video doorbell, who knows who owns Ring, right? Who is it? It's Amazon, right? And Amazon has some of the most talented technology and security folks around. They certainly can afford to invest in security controls. And if a company like Amazon is experiencing a lapse, and for those of you that didn't follow it, it was disclosed, so if you have a Ring video doorbell, you join it to your Wi-Fi. As part of joining it to your Wi-Fi, you put the password in and it joins. That password was transmitting in the clear, which is sort of a fundamental foundational security item. And if a company like Amazon can't get that right, you can't expect some of these manufacturers who are making like very low cost baby monitors or some of these other devices are properly testing, scanning, upgrading firmware, et cetera. It's just really sobering.
Yes, Jonathan. So the question is, has anybody bought a dumb TV lately? Yeah, good luck finding one. It's Android underneath, by the way. And if it's Android underneath, by the way, and some gentleman who had his TV rooted was not able to pay the ransom through his TV, and LG, the manufacturer, had absolutely no idea how to fix that one.
I draw the line at the voice controlled remote. I won't do that.
So let's move on to another question. So because we already talked about some of these devices coming in for good reason, and home healthcare management is exactly one of those really, really good reasons. So I guess the question is, should the liability, and this kind of ties back to Tina's talk, should the liability belong to the manufacturer of the devices, or the hospital, or the healthcare organization? Where's the liability in keeping this all patched and up to date?
Well, the example I'll give on this one was a project I worked on, I say a couple now, time's flying, we start dating ourselves. But it was the advent of Configure. And a hospital organization called us. I went out of town, I won't say the city, because I'll start giving stuff away. But the short of it was a pill cart. And it was the pill cart to administer medicine was infected. And the hospital had cleaned up all the other devices in the hospital, but the pill cart was a managed solution from a medical device manufacturer. So every time they cleaned up the hospital, the nurses would roll the pill carts back down the halls, reinfecting everything in the hospital, and it was kind of this vicious cycle. So we did a proof of concept on hardening that device so it could be infected and not infect everything else. And then the hospital corporation went back to the device manufacturer and made demands about wanting them to fix it, because the hospital and their staff wasn't allowed to touch that device. Even though it was a Windows-based OS, it was Windows Server on the back end, and then the pill carts, I think, were running, I don't even remember what, it was a Windows OS. So they could easily solve this problem. But the minute they touched that device, it was out of support from that manufacturer. So they went back to the manufacturer and said, here's the controls we want you to put in place. The manufacturer looked at it and then came back to the hospital with an additional per device cost. And then nothing happened. Nothing was fixed. So the accountability, when you look at the liability and then at the accountability, one of the big challenges with these devices in a corporate environment is the managed solutions that are being delivered. They want to control them, but they don't want the responsibility and liability for keeping them up to date and removing those exposures.
Great story on that. Other comments, other war stories? Well, actually, we know from the Tesla example, the lawsuits are sitting there. Who do they name? I think the Supreme Court decided a couple years ago that automated driving, the liability was the same as with regular cars. So there was not unlimited liability all the way back to Apple for the embedded system or anything else. It stayed right there with the car and the auto manufacturer. So that was an interesting extension of the liability, because it was, before that, people were actually afraid. It was unknown just how much liability they were entering. Yes?
I'm so old, I remember we used to have, quote, user groups. Again, I was in banking. So we had user groups for different vendor products. We get together to agree on what we wanted in the next version from that vendor. And it was communicated to them with the term, if you don't put this in your next version, we're going to all go and buy your competitor's product. So they were a bit motivated.
Yeah, I think that's called Twitter now. But, yeah,
You sound like a millennial.
I try. Okay, other comments? Yes.
So I've done some work for Cleveland Clinic, who's just about to undergo a complete transformation of all of their medical device equipment, both at the patient monitoring system side and also at the infusion therapy side. And what they're running into, or what I think everybody's running into, is that many of the OSs in these devices are proprietary. They're not even, Windows mobile systems, and the manufacturers of devices aren't willing to do anything about it to change that. That's not their problem, is their perspective. And to replace all the devices in a physical facility like Cleveland Clinic, which has 15,000 beds or something like that, is an enormous cost. So if they're breached or there's a problem, where does the liability lie? Is it Cleveland Clinic's problem? Is it the device company's problem? Or
Any comments?
Well, again, you hit the medical stuff, so I'm going to answer. And I would say the example I gave you was 10 years ago, and the next one I'll give you is within the last 6 months. The The FDA made some changes. We'll see how deep or how much teeth they actually have. But we have seen, we finished a project with one of the manufacturers, and those OSs that you're talking about, yeah, some of them aren't Windows Core and or even kind of, I'll call them commercial versions of Linux, but they are, when you dig under the covers, they're recognizable. The manufacturers have obfuscated them for a while, but again, when you work with them and you dig under, you see what they are. But anyway, getting to the point, it seems that the manufacturers are beginning to take more accountability. And the way that they're approaching it is, from their perspective, they have these devices that are sold and in the field, and there's hundreds of thousands of them. They can't afford to go to recall them, patch them, fix them, put in new controls, new mechanisms for long-term remediation, and push them back out into the field. So they're drawing the line in the sand, and theirs is January 1, and they're saying on January 1, all new devices will roll out with these capabilities, and the capabilities are remote remediation. So I think we'll see a change, at least in that field. It'll probably take, I'll say conservatively, another 10 years, because some of those devices, their active life can be well over 10 years.
The other thing about proprietary, OS, even where they do exist, it's not a protection from, Windows-based attacks, because it's very simple for hackers to obtain one of these devices and analyze them for vulnerabilities, and they do so, at the component level. And whether it's a Windows OS or something else, they'll find out, where is it vulnerable? How do I get in?
I'll also say too, I think there's obviously responsibility and who's to blame is important, but there's a reputational aspect that can't be forgotten. And I think of some law firms that we've recently started working with that, suffered breaches in the past and still going through litigation to determine responsibility, but in not protecting your client data in that first situation, reputation is ruined there. And that's obviously hard to recover. So yes, the litigation needs to be had and, a decision needs to be made there, but when you lose a lot of your clientele because you failed in protecting their data because of IoT, because of connectivity, that can't be forgotten as well.
And I think there's, on the positive side, another hurdle that was cleared, which is that there was a question about whether you'd lose your FDA or you'd have to recertify under the FDA if you made patches. And they just recently, I believe there's enough of a body of decision work that says, no, patching is okay. There's a level of change, and patching falls under that. So one positive hurdle is, with all the other things you've mentioned, is you're not risking your FDA, which is a multi-year process, certification. I think first we saw one there. Yeah, Mike, do you want to take that? Because that really does touch the security governance in enterprise now.
Well, let's talk about governance, as a whole, right? Because it's really, we experience new technologies on an ever increasing rate now, and our governance systems need to be adaptable to deal with the kinds of challenges that you're talking about. So when you look at the Internet of Things, it starts with policy, right? Governance starts with policies. Policy is...
That's true, but yeah, which we'd probably want to take outside, since the span and scope of this panel discussion is the Internet of Things. So, but Well, so let's address it within those, using the agile mechanisms for Internet of Things because it's so rapidly changing. And I think that the governance is a very important aspect of that.
Right. So, so again, governance starts with policy. Policy are statements of management's intent. So, there has to be some kind of policy around the deployment, use, and management of IoT devices, and that could be a separate policy that's created. It could be embedded into a number of existing policies, but wherever it is, it needs to really focus on what are people's responsibilities along the way, and touch that issue we talked about of just like the cloud, there's a concept of shared responsibility with IoT, in that the manufacturer might be responsible for some things. Well, that should be documented somewhere in the policy, who's responsible for what, and with a specific focus on whose liability is it when things go wrong in that area. In addition to policies, you've got to look at your processes and make sure that IoT is accounted for within your processes. So are you accounting for IoT devices in your disaster recovery and business continuity processes? Does your auditing take into account IoT devices? Are you accounting for IoT-based attacks scenarios in your incident response plan, right? And are you testing, when you test that plan, are you using IoT attack scenarios in that testing? So there's a number of areas where you've got to really specifically and intentionally, look at what you're doing as far as governance, and make sure IoT is accounted for there. And it turns out that one of the biggest areas, that covers, some of the most important controls when it comes to IoT, are embedded in your procurement process and your supply chain processes, right? Because that's where you're going to do things like make sure that there's a valid business case for bringing IoT into an environment that outweighs the risk of doing so, right? Start there, and then when you're talking to manufacturers of IoT devices, part of that procurement should be, finding out how these things are being tested and what the results of that testing is. Things like securing the right to scan devices, and if you can't get the right to scan devices, making sure that the manufacturer is willing to send you vulnerability scan results of the devices and update those every time the firmware of the device is changed. So there's a number of things in the supply chain and procurement area that are very important to the controls within IoT.
Yeah, and I see your question, but hang on a second. I just Well, I think that actually what you've already covered is, because it all comes down to this is, and we literally have decades of experience all the way reaching back to PCs. Understand what you have, the asset management's there, control the versioning, do the patch. So the same thing for voting machines. And actually, I know a colleague of mine who was actually in that business for quite a while. It does have some specific requirements because of the laws of paper records or anything, but the basic principles of you're going to have flawed code, you're going to have half-trained people, so therefore you have to have the governance and controls around it to detect. You just have a huge amplification of the traceability aspect that's present anyway. I did want to come back and let other people have a chance to talk as well about.
I just wanted to ask Laszlo if the voting machine scenario was in your list of everything possible that could go wrong.
Yes. It's being recorded. I'll talk outside the room.
If I come back to the question about agile development methodology, let me try to link it to IoT. And so the link that I would say is there is innovation, right? And so in many people's minds, and I won't comment on my own organization, innovation, often means go fast. And so people think security controls make me go slow. And what I try to tell people is, look, if you are in a race and you think in a car race, and you think you want to make the car go faster, you're going to remove the brakes. That's a recipe for disaster. You're not going to go faster. And so what I always tell people is, look, innovation and security can go hand in hand. You have to innovate in a smart way. And so to the point that you make about, Agile is cutting corners, right? Because they want to go fast. I think the same applies to IoT, and a lot of these firms really just want to get product to market as fast as they can, and most people don't think beyond the sale to the consumer. They're not thinking about how does that device get used and what's the lifetime of it. And what really blew me away is when we saw some of these big DDoS attacks that were a function of compromised IoT devices. We found out through research that some of those IoT devices themselves had no facility for firmware patching. They were out, they were connected, and there was like virtually no way to fix them, short of black holing the IPs that the traffic was coming from, which is not necessarily sustainable. And we see things like, some of the cable companies, and forgive me if anybody here works for one of these organizations, they're setting their residents up to create shared networks, right? And I get this pop-up message that says, "Hey, there's a Wi-Fi signal, nearby." I'm like, "No, do not connect." And we see in work, we see attacks that we attribute back to compromised residential, cable modems. And it's because, I think in the spirit of innovation, people are thinking about usability and speed to market, and innovation means go fast. But really, you got to innovate with responsibility, and that's part of the point we make when we talk about Agile. And I think that's the same thing that these manufacturers of IoT devices have to keep in mind, is that they're really creating weapons that produce a lot of unintended consequences.
And I think you brought up a number of good points, that moving fast does not mean being irresponsible. It's bad Agile, just like there's bad waterfall, and then there are, with all the best intentions, but the pursuit of market, device manufacturers adding features that suddenly put them into a world that they didn't know before. And I'll give one example, but then also address directly, David, your point before. Just in the last couple of months, I was talking to our CTO, and we actually came up with what I think is a fascinating trick. We wrote the security user stories. We wrote the security requirements as user stories, and we created that as a package. And we insisted that every project manager at the instantiation, the initiation of a project, insert those stories along with everybody else in there. That became part of their capacity. It became part of their metrics. It leveraged the process, saying, you can't ignore me. And all we did was, we said, here's an envelope, stick it in Jira. And we're still playing that out. We're still playing with that. But I actually think it's a trick that will work. The other thing about accidentally, even though it's a little bit old, the Fitbit story to me is absolutely a perfect example that they realized that of all the data and behavior they were storing up in the cloud, they could tell when a spouse was cheating on the partner. Okay. Can you imagine the conversations they must have had? How did we get here? How do we get out of here? How do we move forward? Do we disclose or not disclose? They didn't mean to do that. They thought they were on the path of all that's good in humanity, with the Fitbit. So the thing is, you want to have the control to notice, and you want to have the governance to react, because you just sometimes fall in this situation. Yeah.
Well, I think you just laid out the legal loophole. We're not an IoT device. We're not responsible. So my opinion on that would be that, one, you will see people trying to declass themselves. Then others, you'll see people looking for loopholes that the software wasn't developed in California. You know, the device wasn't manufactured in California. It was sold through a reseller. So as a manufacturer, I don't have that liability. It'd be interesting to see that. State-only teeth. Everybody has to start. Things have to start somewhere. But the teeth behind it is really what's going to matter.
And that's with every law. So you're going to see people are not going to panic on January 1st. Frankly, not panicking now. They're going to do things to stall for time, but also just not be the first to be sued under that so that they can watch how the case law develops. But it's a good thing. I mean, I'm glad they're doing that. That will test and make it easier for the other states. And then finally, the variations from the multiple states, if it works, will generate pressure for a federal law that kind of smooths it all out.
I mean, that's one of the, that's one of the issues whenever there's something new like this, some new legal requirement is, before a device manufacturer is going to go spend a lot of money, they're going to want to see, what kind of guidance is issued when they do start enforcing these things, to figure out if there are either loopholes or ways to meet the requirement that are going to be less expensive. So there's always a lag there between when the requirement comes out and when there's some kind of response to it. And it usually involves waiting to find that guidance.
Okay. Yeah, let's take your question. I think it is a point. I'm not sure that there's, I think it answered your own question. That over time, these sort of things do get sorted out, and we have a blueprint for it because we've done it multiple times before.
The point with the phone was people replaced it every 2 years because the battery went out, right? And these IoT devices, I don't know what they're useful like. It could be 10 years.
I did hold up a 6-year-old phone, by the way.
They'll all have all the employees for a long
Yeah.
There's one aspect of that's intriguing, and that's that the devices do change, right? And we know from experience that generally more mature devices are more secure devices, and that's why part of this whole thing is that we've got to be cognizant of are there older devices out there that need to be removed from the environment because there are more secure versions of them, and that's a huge challenge, right? Because you don't always know where these are. We talked about earlier. One of the panelists mentioned who's got an inventory of all their assets, right? And that's just traditional assets, right? So discovery is a huge challenge in IoT, and but to the extent that we can remove older devices and replace them with newer devices, we're improving our security.
So,
I was just going to say, I think there's a threshold of unmanageability that we're approaching, if not already here. And to the point of inventory, as these devices become more available, I don't think most people understand there's a management and configuration responsibility. My mother-in-law has, a cable modem and a laptop and an iPad, and I tried to teach her, hey, look, you gotta, it's gotta be patched, and forget it. Like, there's just no way, and like I try to patch my devices regularly. I have a wireless router. I get locked out 100% of the time I try to patch it, and I have to look up the serial number on the bottom and it authenticate like 100% of the time, and I consider myself relatively savvy. And I'm like, there's just no way normal people are going through this rigor. Like, I have 3 other people. I have my wife and 2 kids, and every time a new iOS patch comes out, I'm like, all right, everyone, you patch, and then 3 months later, I happen to look at my son's phone, and there's the red mark that's, and I'm like, you didn't patch, man, I told you.
and how did we end up being the IT support for our household? That's what I want to know.
But my sense is that's the exception, and my sense is most people have no clue, right? And most people don't, and they're walking around with default admin credentials on whatever their routers are and their wire and all this stuff, and it gets patched maybe. And so I think it's an intractable challenge we're faced with.
So what I want to do, because we have a nice conversational style with everybody now out, but I'm also looking at the time. And so so those who still have questions, will still be here. So forth. What I wanted to do though is just take, once around here, bring it to the corporate environment, because you're all bringing up really good points. And what's the change? What's one piece of advice you give the executives and the leaders that they should look at things in a changed way or a different way because of IoT? And Josh, maybe we could start with you.
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing I see is the visibility aspect. So I'm always surprised, at the start of a POC when I ask the question, how many devices do you have on your network? The first question there is, well, what do you mean by a device? And my response to that is, well, yes, your desktops, your workstations, but all IoT devices, what are we seeing in the cloud? So pushing beyond that initial, frame that it's just those devices you think of right up front, those desktops, those laptops. And I then get that number and, we install on a network and we're usually seeing 30 to 40% higher than that. And that to me is the visibility question. So obviously there's value in, spinning up agents on devices and getting visibility through that, but there's also some value of sitting at the core and looking at everything that's traversing through a core and gaining that visibility into all devices on your network. So for me, when I'm working with my clients, that's the biggest thing I'm pushing is what is your inventory? How do you understand what your assets are on your network? And it's a lot beyond the initial thought of, oh, it's, what's in the office. So that for me is really, and I think that mindset is changing a bit. And when I ask that question, the answers are getting better, but there's still a ways to go in improving that.
Very good, Alex.
What he said, squared, and it's something that's kind of my tilting at windmills has always been the asset piece, understanding what you have, and someone using a deck I saw a couple of weeks ago, they brought up the old Rumsfeld. Known knowns and then known unknowns. Those are two things we can all do. The data's there, the tools are there, we have everything to know that. Then we're left with the unknown unknowns. And I would say we're never going to know those, we can never deal with them. But start looking and start considering that you have to understand what your known unknowns are. And it begins with that inventory.
So it's I guess this is the last session. So we've talked today about we started off with all the things that are going wrong today with the situation we have. We're having this discussion, which is one of the biggest challenges of what we're dealing with today in the Internet of Things. We saw Laszlo's presentation about everything that's waiting for us tomorrow, and it's easy to get kind of discouraged when you think about it. So I know I'm not answering your question, but
this is not my question. It's give them a piece of advice.
yeah. So this would be my advice. When I was in my early 20s, I discovered the secret of dealing with Chicago winters, and it was all a perspective thing, right? I started thinking about Chicago winters as a survival exercise. And it kind of started becoming fun, and it changed my whole thought on how to deal with Chicago winters, right? And this is a very similar exercise, right? When we look at the kinds of challenges we're talking about today, a lot of it is perspective, right? But these are opportunities to kind of put on your creative problem solver hat and go out and figure out how do we deal with this? And there's not always going to be, some magic product out there that's the answer for this, right? There are some products that do a lot of good stuff, right? I noticed DarkTrace was here today, and when we're talking about the Internet of Things, behavioral analysis is a huge control, right? Because we can at least, figure out what is this type of device supposed to be doing, and get alerted when it's doing something else, right? That'd give you a good idea that maybe it's been compromised, right? So there are some good tools out there, but sometimes the answer is combining multiple tools, right? It's not always easy, but when I look back on my career, those were the most rewarding things. We're solving problems like that when there wasn't an easy answer, right? So I would just encourage everybody to keep that perspective.
Jasper?
You can't secure what you don't know. So I can't emphasize inventory enough. You have to know what you've got, and then you have to know what it's doing. I'll leave it at that, inventory.
Yep. And you know what? Kind of combining all of the things here, it's like, you don't have to put up with this. Right? Why can't you just put them on a separate network and just say, my corporate resources are my corporate resources. You have this little playground network here where you can infect each other all you want, but I'm going to guard that boundary until I understand it more. So, I mean, that's what we did with Wi-Fi networks. You know, I'm a lazy thinker. Whatever worked before, I'm going to do it again. You got a pill card? I want it. Anyway, thank you all for listening. Thank you to the panelists. Really enjoyed it.